I'm going to just say a quick word of welcome, and I need to unfortunately run off tonight, but we're very excited to have Rabbi Markiz back with us. I know he's taught with us the past number of years, came to visit our congregation, I believe, a couple of years ago now. It's always wonderful to have you with us and teaching this year as we anticipate and prepare for Purim, which is going to be coming up. We still have some time, which we get to really delve in depth
It's
into
not even Tu B'Shvat.
Purim.
No.
That's not even Tu B'Shvat. But very excited. I'm going to turn it over to you, and great to see you. Great to have
Fantastic.
you with us.
So happy to be here and to be with all of you. For those who have their cameras off, I invite you to turn them on, but do what feels right for you. We are going to, as Rabbi Foster said, we're going to talk Purim. And part of what I wanted to do in this series is to try and look at the holiday and the stories and the characters with fresh eyes, with new eyes, and to do so while asking ourselves interesting and challenging questions. And so that's what I hope to do tonight. My hope, but perhaps expectation, is that some folks might be a little uncomfortable with the kinds of questions we're asking, but in a good way. And so I invite you to lean into it. I promise nothing too crazy. So I think it should be interesting. Any questions before we get started? Other than, what are you even talking about? Okay. I'm going to share my screen here, and you'll give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Our topic for this evening, I have a lot I want to talk about, so that's why I'm jumping right in, is the question. Oh, actually, before I share my screen, I take it back. We're going to talk about Vashti tonight and who she is and what her deal is and whether or not she is a hero or a villain in this story. And so before we get into the text that I have here, would someone like to summarize, maybe the first 10 or 15 verses of the book of Esther, which is this whole story we have with Vashti? Someone like to summarize what happens at the beginning of the book of Esther?
I'll take a stab if you like, which
Please.
is Ahasuerus is having a big party to celebrate some milestone in his reign. Uh, it gets described in a certain amount of detail. In any event, all kinds of people are invited to it. He tells Vashti to come. Some would say he tells her to come naked. Um, she refuses, and she is no longer queen one way or another, because Ahasuerus gets advice that you can't have your wife defy you. What would happen? Everybody in the kingdom would have wives who defy them, so you can't allow it.
Amazing. That's a fantastic summary, and exactly right. Ahasuerus and others are having these feasts. Ahasuerus requests Vashti's presence, presumably naked. She refuses, and she is punished effectively by not being queen. I think you put it exactly right. It's not clear whether or not she gets exiled or she's executed or what have you. In one way or another, we don't see her again. We see the impacts of her choices, but we don't necessarily see her. And so we're going to use that as background to just make sure we're all on the same page. And so the question I'm curious about tonight is, what's Vashti's deal? Where does she come from? What informs the choices she made? What are the consequences of the choices she makes? And my hope is that we won't come up with a good answer, because I don't think it's particularly clear. So I'm excited to see what you all think. And can I get a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Forgive me, my computer today. Yes, can people see it? Fantastic. Sorry, that was me just waiting on everything to load. Okay, fantastic. So, and we already summarized what happens in the story. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, who is Vashti anyway? Where is she coming from? What's her deal? And we have this really interesting quote from one of the Midrashim, Esther Rabbah. And it says the following. Rav said, everything that the Holy Blessed One said, God said about him, or sort of about this family line. It's about the Babylonians. It's taking this quote from Isaiah. And we're not going to get lost in it too much, other than to make a single point. So I will eliminate from Babylonian name and remnant, child and grandchild. That's the language in Isaiah. And the rabbis are coming back, Rav is coming back and defining, there's a couple of other alternative definitions, who each of these pieces are in the book of Isaiah and who it is. So the first is you have name, which is Nebuchadnezzar. You have remnant, which is evil Merodach, which, just to say, this is not a character I'm familiar with. The word evil is here in Aramaic, or in Hebrew rather, and I don't know what to do with that yet. So whether or not, I'm not exactly sure how that comes to be. It's not a subject for us today. I'm just naming it because it sort of surprises me. You have the child and grandchild, Belshazzar, and grandchild, who is Belshazzar's child, which is Vashti. Which is to say, who is Vashti? She is a royal Babylonian. She's not just Ahasuerus's wife. She comes from a royal line all on her own. She has yichus, if you will, right? She comes with authority and history that is not shared in the book of Esther. So the question we might then ask is, how the heck did she end up in this situation with Ahasuerus? Who is he? Where does he come from? Masechet Megillah sort of unpacks the strange phrasing at the beginning of the verse, the beginning of the book, and you'll forgive me for reading and being sort of talking heavy at the front. We'll have time for discussion, I promise. The language at the beginning of the verse, at the beginning of the book of Esther, is Ahasuerus, who reigned, Hamolech, from Mehodu ad Kush, from these two different places, from India to Ethiopia. And the Gemara notices the strange language that shows up, because in the Torah and the Tanakh, that's not the language that's used. The language is, we have this king who became the king in the year of his reign, blah, 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 blah. And it's weird. The language is different than it is in Tanakh, in the rest of Tanakh. And so what Rav and Rashi, who affirms this, interprets this, is to say, who reigned? What does this mean? It comes to teach that Ahasuerus reigned on his own. Shemalach me'atzmo, which Steinsaltz and Rashi seem to suggest means he did not inherit the crown. And one article I read about this suggested that he actually staged a coup, and that's how he became in power. Which is to say, we have an interesting scenario such where we have a commoner, or some you'll see why I say commoner in a moment. We have this non-royal person who is in a royal position married to a royal person with a long history. Is everybody with me so far? Yeah? Okay. We're going to look at one more source, and then I'm going to stop talking, and we'll have a chance to discuss it together. Can I get a volunteer to read this second Megillah text here? Source number 3.
Who reigned, Rav said.
No, the next one.
Therefore the king was very wrathful.
Yes, please.
Why did his anger burn in him so greatly? Rava said Vashti not only refused to come, but she also sent him a message. You, son of my father's stableman, Belshazzar, my father drank wine.
Let's pause there.
Yeah.
Pause there for a second. So we have this scenario, right? We're sort of bouncing back and forth, and you'll forgive me for the way we're doing this here. We have this quote from the Gemara, or from the book of Esther, who says that the king was very wrathful. Ahasuerus was angry. So the question is why? Why was he so angry? Is it just that she refused? Rava says Not only did she refuse to come, but she sent him a note. And that note begins by saying, "You son of my father stableman," which is to say, not only did he stage a coup, or not only was he not royal, he was the son of the royal stableman. His job was, carrying horse poop around, right? That is not a particularly authoritative guy, right? So that's how she begins her note. Sheila, will you please read the second half? Belshazzar.
Belshazzar, my father, drank wine against 1,000 men and did not become inebriated, as in the verse in Daniel testifies about him. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, drank wine before the 1,000, and that man Ahasuerus has become senseless from his wine. Due to her audacity, immediately his anger burnt in him.
Amazing. Which is to say, not only are you the son of the stableman, right? You can't hold your wine. Real royals can hold their wine. My father could have, drink with 1,000, totally fine. You, not so much.
It doesn't answer the question why she married him.
It does not answer the question of why she married him. You're right.
Her marriage sanctifies his, by marrying her, it legitimizes him.
Yeah.
And he doesn't deserve all this.
Ostensibly, right? So we have this funny scenario. We'll pause here to sort of unpack this together for folks who want to share. We have this question, so who exactly is Vashti? How does she show up in this situation? How do they talk to each other? And it's not so great.
I have a little historical problem.
Yes,
which is
please.
the Persians conquer the Babylonians, which is what allows the first exile to end relatively quickly. How likely is it that the conquering Persians would somehow eventually have as their king a Babylonian stable boy? I mean, I think the rabbis are probably writing this, for their own reasons, but I don't think they're paying any attention to actual history.
You would be 100% correct. There's a fantastic article on thetorah.com where I pulled a bunch of these sources from. And the rabbis are wrong about the historicity of Belshazzar and a bunch of other things. And so 100%, we should take this with a boulder of salt, if you will, right? There's a lot wrong here. But at least what we can garner is that the rabbis had at least a view, not an exclusive view, but a view of who Vashti was. And it wasn't necessarily as a good guy.
But Vashti is challenging the king. Okay. The question is that when Esther,
we haven't gotten
may not know about, but she may or may not know about it because they didn't have the contest yet, because she is just like the opposite of Vashti. She knows her place.
We're going to come back. We're not really going to talk about Esther too much, but we're going to come back to that. So hold on to it, bookmark it, because we're going to come back to that a little bit. Other thoughts? Are people uncomfortable with this thread about Vashti?
No.
Okay, that's okay.
Hooray for the women, for the women.
It may be that if you're trying to construct something about Ahasuerus' temperament and the kind of foolishness he engages in the course of Megillat Esther, maybe this is a backstory that helps build that story.
Yeah, exactly right.
I've always looked at the Megillah as being far out and not there's no basis for it, and this just seems like it's even further out.
Yeah. The Megillah is all sorts of funny things, right? It's like part farce, part palace intrigue, part serious story about the battle for survival, and also full of puns. So it's a bit of an enigma. And here the rabbis who are taking it as seriously as the rabbis did are pulling all sorts of things from here. And this doesn't end here. We're going to unpack a little bit more the next question, which is, what was this feasting all about in the first place? As David well summarized earlier, was it just a party? Was it a celebration? Right? It was the third year, I think, of his reign, or he had just accomplished the third year of being in charge. What's going on here? And we're going to see the rabbis are also uncomfortable what's going on here. Can I get another volunteer to read this first one? Or number 4, rather. Yeah, Nina.
Okay. Also, Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. Why did she hold the feast in the royal house, a place of men, rather than in the women's house, where it should have been?
I'm going to pause there for a second, Nina. Just pause for a second. We're going to get a different answer than what I'm about to tell you. But if we put Vashti in the context of being royal in a way that Ahasuerus isn't, it kind of makes sense for her to be in the royal house while he ends up being in the outside. I forget exactly the word. The sort of palace grounds. It's an interesting reversal of what we generally see in Tanakh about male and female power here. Anyway, Nina, keep going. I'm sorry.
Oh, wait a minute. Rabbi said the two of them had sinful intentions. Ahasuerus wished to fornicate with the women, and Vashti wished to fornicate with the men. This explains the folk saying that people say, he with pumpkins and his wife with zucchinis, indicating that often a man and his wife engage in similar actions.
So here we go. Here we're discovering perhaps Vashti is no peach after all. She's a zucchini, right? Potentially, according to this view of from the rabbis, she's also up to no good. It's not just him. And how do we know this? Because of the location. It's in the house. It's in a place of authority, right? She's not relegated to the place of women. She's being a place where other people might be. And this invites us to potentially see that they were both in it. They were both looking to do something licentious here. And then this whole pumpkins and zucchinis thing, I just think is a real, it cracks me up here, right? There's like all sorts of things we say, peas in a pod, I think might be a more common expression today, right? 2 peas in a pod, pumpkins and zucchinis. I think we could all start using pumpkins and zucchinis from here on out. Right?
The reason for the feast, according to Gordis, his version of the Megillah, is that they were preparing for war, and before you go to war, you want to live it up.
Yes. So part of what I want to do
is quoting other people, but he's saying
for sure.
Yeah.
I'm showing you. I'm going to show you one view, and I'm going to show you the opposite view in a little bit. Which is to say, I'm trying to pull Vashti out of the story, right? Like we're not trying, like a little bit outside of context here, because we only have a couple of verses with her. We really want to try to understand what's her deal, right? But your point well made, right? There's lots of answers here. I'm only showing you a very thin layer of it. Can I get another volunteer to read the next paragraph here, paragraph 5?
Go ahead.
Please, Larry.
So too at the feast of the wicked man Ahasuerus, where the men began to converse, someone said, the Median women are the most beautiful, while others said the Persian women are the most beautiful. Ahasuerus said to them, the vessel that I use, that is my wife, is neither Median nor Persian, but rather Chaldean. Do you wish to see her? They said to him, yes, provided that she be naked.
Okay, now we get a new view of this feast here, which is to say, they were debating about why they got married in the first place. And he was suggesting, right? They were talking about, who is the most beautiful. Certainly hate the language of the vessel that I used. Really, really quite demeaning. Which is to say, right? He says, well, my wife's not either of these two categories. She's Chaldean or Babylonian, right? And says, well, let me bring her in, show you how beautiful she is. one of the commentaries I read suggested that the reason why he did this was so that he would not be seen as having just married her for being a royal, right? But for her beauty, for some other category or any other reason. And it wasn't him necessarily, Achashverosh, but the cadre of individuals around him who said, yeah, but make sure she's naked, which again, totally demeaning, problematic on so many levels. So again, we're like,
yeah, but it's also interesting. I mean, it's interesting. Why? I mean, do we have to have this? I mean, why are they? They're really making the rabbis or whoever wrote Megillah is trying to really make her look bad, and Achashverosh bad. As we say, this is a parody problem, most likely. It's an exaggeration of each character.
Yeah, I think the rabbis, or some thread of the rabbis, and you'll see it gets worse in just a second, are really trying to make her look terrible. I don't
doing
think
it to everybody. They all really look bad, including Esther. You know, when we ask what was she eating, and why was she, even involved in this? Nobody looks very good.
Nobody looks good. I will recommend, just as a side note, we did a project. I work with exploringjudaism.org, which folks should know about. And we did a series of interviews last year around Purim and other holidays, sort of unpacking people's wisdom around it. And there's one video in particular, maybe before we'll end, I'll hunt it down and put it in the chat, where one of my colleagues has the most incredible read of Achashverosh, not as some fool, but as an amoral genius. And it has totally changed my view of Achashverosh, and well worth finding. So if you don't find it here, or we don't have time to talk about it here, on Exploring Judaism, there's a podcast or video podcast we put it called Holiday Bites, and you can find it on the website on there. And I would strongly recommend that. Is like totally changed my view here about Achashverosh. None of which is relevant for our conversation here. It's just really interesting. So we're starting to build this story, this question of whether or not Vashti is this hero, and these sources seem to suggest she's a villain. And just to sort of as a way of moving us forward here, we get pretty much the worst one yet, which is to say, the Gemara tells us that a person is punished for the way they acted in life. And why was Vashti punished the way she was? Because wicked Vashti would take the daughters of Israel, strip them naked, and make them work on Shabbat. Therefore, it was decreed that she should be brought before the king naked, which there's an argument as to what, that the day would happen to be Shabbat. As it is written, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. That is to say, what she had done with young Jewish women, it was decreed upon her. Now, is this in the text? Not remotely. Not at all. This is totally rabbinic.
Evidence that the Jews were being persecuted this way.
It's not right. It's not in the text, but it is a thread that exists. So I hope everybody is sufficiently uncomfortable with this story, because we definitely don't see Vashti. We don't talk about Vashti in this way. And I share it because we're about to see the other side of the equation here, which is to say that I don't think it's obvious one way or another. There is certainly a thread in the tradition that says this is not a good guy. Or Sheila, as you said, like nobody's good in the story. Everybody's a bad guy in the story, and Vashti is not excluded from that. So then we can start.
Something else that you just brings up the whole idea. It's who was it? We are always trying to justify all the. I know. Who is it? The bad guy? Oh, Esau. There is a whole trend of people who are trying to justify Esau, that he wasn't so bad. And that's what you have here then with us. I mean, that's what's coming to mind now when you say that. They were trying to justify that this is us today, that we're trying to justify all the people who are the so-called bad guys in the Bible.
Yeah, so I think one thread, and we'll, together, well, like once we get through everything, we'll have a chance to like really unpack it together. the Jewish tradition generally does not. I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know collectively, which is Jewish tradition is not interested in making heroes perfect. All of our heroes are broken, challenged, difficult individuals with personal histories that are complex. Moses, Joseph, the patriarchs, the matriarchs, everybody, it's not one way or another. And here also, we have a thread that suggests that Vashti is not so great, despite the way she stood up for herself. And so here, let's talk about it. We haven't yet, so now we're going to talk about it. Esther Rabbah. So this is from a midrash as well. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's word by means of the officials, and the king was very angry, and his fury burned within him. So again, we started to get this story earlier when we were talking about who Achashverosh was, that Vashti was sending notes to him to say no. And here's another take on that dynamic. She sent and said to him things that upset him. All right, so why was she angry? Why was he angry, rather? She said to him, if they consider me beautiful, they will set their sights on taking advantage of me and will kill you. If they consider me ugly, you will not be demeaned. You will be demeaned because of me. Which is to say, she refused not just because she didn't want. She was also protecting her husband. No matter which way, if I show up, it's gonna be bad. It's gonna be bad for you. It's gonna be bad for me. Nobody wins in this equation. This is a bad call. The Gemara, the Midrash suggests that he didn't totally get it, which goes to that point that perhaps he was more foolish than we think. And the next one sends a second note. She said and sent to him, weren't you the stable boy of my father's house? And you were accustomed to bringing naked prostitutes before you. And now that you have ascended to the throne, you have not abandoned your corruption. Which is to say, back when nobody cared, you made some pretty poor choices. You haven't broken your habits. I'm not showing up that way. Right? You haven't, you're acting in a really terrible manner, and I'm not going with it. Midrash goes on to say, I didn't totally get it. And here's the last argument she makes, the last note she sends. She said, even the opposition to my father's house was not judged naked. That is what is written, and these men were bound in their trousers, their tunics, and their hats. Which is to say, when my father was in charge, a real royal, not only could he hold his wine, but he treated people with respect. He didn't make them get naked in front of them. And I'm not going to either. And the Malbim, who's a commentator, goes on to say, can I get a volunteer to read what the Malbim says here? Anybody want to read?
You want me to read again?
Sure, unless somebody who hasn't spoken is feeling an itch to read the Malbim.
All right. His ultimate goal then was to show the nations and the ministers that he did not marry her for her lineage, but for her beauty, since she was beautiful. For if he had married her for her lineage, and thus through her royalty came to inherit the kingdom, he would not then show her off for her beauty. For whether beautiful or ugly, he would have married her, since with her comes the kingdom. So this way he reveals that he does not consider her a queen in her own right, and that he rules only because of himself, his strength, and his power. Wow.
Which is to say, in our context here, he's totally demeaning in almost every which way, not just because she's naked, but he doesn't even respect her existence as queen, even though she's clearly got yichus. And she has no reason to have to justify her existence here. No reason at all. So here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to pause. There are two more things I want to read, but they're modern and relevant, and I want to get to them when we get to them. We've been sort of staring at words this whole time. So let's take a pause. How do people feel about these narratives, these stories about Vashti? People hear me? What do people think? People agree, disagree, like, dislike. What's Vashti's deal here?
She's a nothing.
I'm sorry?
She's a nothing. They're both, you have two idiots who are in command there. It sounds like today's. It's not much different from today, is it?
Other thoughts?
And not just in the United States.
Yeah, we'll leave politics to the side for today.
I think it's interesting, and the one that builds her up in the sense that she has actual reasons that politically this is a mistake. And he apparently doesn't get that, and it just makes him angry. So again, it seems to be a way of tearing him down a little bit. I mean, we've already decided, or I should say the rabbis have decided, that he's the son of a stable boy who just happens to have ended up king through some kind of coup. And now we're putting in her mouth that she's got the political seichel that he lacks.
Yeah. Yeah. She's savvy, perhaps, right? In ways that he couldn't possibly imagine. Yeah. And not only that, but doing it for both their sakes, right? Not just her own, right? But for him too.
Yeah, in that respect, it's kind of like it should be galling on her if any of this were literally true, that she's the daughter of a king and he's a usurping stable boy's son. But the implication, at least of that paragraph where she's alluding and he's not understanding, is that she's made her peace with that because she's still the queen. And there's still a kingdom, ostensibly much bigger kingdom than Babylon was on its own.
Huge.
So,
yeah. And not only that, perhaps that she was an authoritative figure, right? In the sense that she was taking care of this kingdom that they were in charge of together. Possibly, right? Any other thoughts?
Did she love him, and did they fall in love before he usurped the throne?
Yeah, I don't know. Certainly the way they seem to talk to each other, perhaps not so much.
Yeah, in other words, what came first?
I mean,
Throne or the marriage?
while the Purim story can be seen as a kind of a carnival story where everything's turned on its head, I guess the rabbis are in the spirit of that, because they don't really explain how it's possible that the stable boy son in the conquered land somehow becomes the king of the conqueror.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we read these two narratives together, certainly through rabbinic lenses, I think we are sort of in the upside down and then upside down again. It's topsy-turvy. I think the rabbis like us didn't know what to make of this story and the various characters and backgrounds that they're inventing for them, or deriving, perhaps might be a more gentle term. I don't, that's why I called this hero or villain. I don't think it's obvious, right? I mean, clearly she did something that we as moderns think is courageous and powerful and meaningful. And we're going to read, I have two more things that I think speak to that. And also we have this thing, which is like, she's kind of cruel in her own way also, potentially. And that's not good. Those things can both exist, perhaps, together. And they're not mutually exclusive. Let's read a little bit more. So I found these two wonderful pieces, modern voices, that sort of these are excerpts and then sort of edited even down further. There's just not enough space. I there was so much I wanted to share that I found that I didn't get a chance for us to do. So I sort of tried to get the core parts. So this is of a much longer piece, which I did not get a chance to fully read, but this was just a couple of paragraphs from this piece called Taking Back Purim by Rabbi Tamara Cohen, who's not someone I'm particularly familiar with. And she reads the following. We are also challenged ourselves to move beyond the dichotomy of bad queen / good queen and good feminist / bad feminist, and embrace a wider spectrum of possibility for women's leadership. For much of the Jewish interpretive tradition, Vashti was the bad queen and Esther the good one. Then, in the days of early Jewish feminism, Vashti was resurrected and celebrated for her open defiance of the king and her powerful defense of her body and sexuality. Not surprisingly, as Vashti's popularity grew, Esther fell out of favor. Feminists were not sure whether they could accept two different models of powerful women. It's time for us to make room in our myths and in our communities for more than one model of leadership. It's time for us to learn from both Esther and Vashti, from both the Jewish women in our text and the non-Jewish women and men. It is time to celebrate women's power and to question the ways we've always wielded over others. What do people think about what Rabbi Cohen has said here?
True. This is exactly it. It goes back and forth depending on who is in. I wouldn't say who's in charge. Who's in charge literally? You know, in literature, not literally, but
who is an authoritative voice
in literature? Right. Okay.
Yeah, and whatever, you know, in our modern ways of approaching text, we looked at mostly, you know, Midrash and Talmud before this. Malbim is being much more recent. This is even more. This is in our common era, in our most modern times.
Well, it's true. Some people like women who are very strong and authoritative. I'm talking about among women. In other words, young women, some young women tend to sneer at older people like myself, like some of us, because we are not as independent, maybe, or we expect more of a man. Maybe we don't look at ourselves as such dominant people, persons.
Yeah.
Or, you know, we have accomplished people, but this was not the way we were brought up.
Yeah, I think that look, I am not a woman, and I'm not going to speak from what women feel about themselves. That's not a position I can hold. I want to be really careful around generalization, and I think that's part of what Rabbi Cohen is encouraging us here, which is to like allow that space for nuance, which I think is really powerful. David, you were going to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe what she's referring to, because I don't know that I accept this dichotomy, at least now, but maybe I could see that it could be a historical dichotomy from, say, the 60s and 70s on. But I think it, especially since they don't even overlap in the story, there's no reason why one has to be good and the other bad, or one has to be powerful and the other weak, or that one has to be the opposite of the other at all. I think if someone were going to rewrite the Megillat Esther in the way that maybe Wicked is a rewrite of the Wizard of Oz, then no doubt Esther and Vashti would get together towards the end of the story because they would have been in on it together all along.
It's very possible. There's a great on the Jewish Women's Archive. There's a great sort of like modern midrash on some of this that I think is worth engaging with. Yeah, Nina, please.
I think personally, all the years that I've known the Purim story, both women, Vashti and Esther, to me, were very strong. And at least through my understanding of the story, I agree with David. They never meet, and they stood individually alone from each other. And I was also thinking, back in the day when kings chose wives, many times it was political, geographic. There were families, there were certain kingdoms that other kingdoms wanted to be connected to through marriage. So I don't really know where love or feelings come into play during this kind of a reign. And also, I thought I had heard some midrash that Vashti was very, very young, and maybe like a teenager or something. Or I might be getting my stories mixed up. But I thought, because sometimes she's portrayed with pimples, if I
God.
recall.
I will say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, that there is a midrash where she has one of the reasons why she refuses is because she gets leprosy, which I'd never seen the pimples thing before, but I wonder if those things are related. I've not heard the other midrash about age, but it's certainly possible. I didn't read every midrash.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on.
Yeah, so I guess I've used both of them as role models, myself, in terms of strong in conviction, and
Yeah.
both stood up to Ahasuerus.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we're going to read the final piece that I selected. I know there's a lot of sources this time. That's usually I like to have more conversation, but this was just too much, and I was so excited to share what I had found that you'll forgive me for having so much to read as opposed to stuff to discuss. There's an interesting question, right, about how they do and don't encounter each other, Esther and Vashti. We've not really talked about Esther very much at all. Obviously, she's an important part of the story. The book is named for her, all sorts of other things. And so, we're in this funny tension of trying to manage, well, how do we manage Esther while we're talking about Vashti? This last piece, it's called Vashti and Esther, A Feminist Perspective by Wendy Amsalem. She's writing from an Orthodox woman's perspective. Piece is wonderful in its entirety. I would strongly recommend people find it. And it's well worth reading. This is just again, because there's only so much I can fit on a sheet. And it's just really, it speaks to this question about how they encounter each other. And I know it's long, so you'll forgive me, but I'm going to read it, and then we'll use the rest of our time to unpack it together. Although Vashti and Esther never meet, the relationship between them is integral to understanding the events of the book of Esther. Vashti disappears by the end of the first chapter, but she casts a long shadow over the rest of the book. As we encounter Vashti in chapter 1, we learn the following about her. She is beautiful, she is headstrong, she throws a good party, she refuses to have her appearances before the king regulated solely by his desires. And for this last offense, Vashti pays dearly, losing her crown and incurring perpetual banishment from the king's presence. At the close of chapter 1, it is clear that a woman in Ahasuerus' court could do well to be dutiful and to come before the king as he commands. The essentiality of female obedience is further confirmed by the final verse of the chapter, in which a missive is sent to all of Ahasuerus' subjects, reminding them in no uncertain terms that every man must rule in his household. By contrast, Esther is presented at first as the perfect foil to Vashti. Whereas Vashti was willful and independent, Esther is passive and submissive. The reflexive use of the Hebrew word lakach, meaning to take, right, to be taken, is constantly applied to her. She is taken in by Mordechai as a foster daughter, taken to the king's harem, and taken before the king. She is the model of docility, an exact antidote to Vashti. She was chosen to be queen since she represented the antithesis of Vashti's persona. Esther's position, her identity, and quite possibly her life are all closely tied to her obedience to the king. In this moment of fate, Esther looks into her mirror and discovers she does not look quite so different from Vashti after all. She takes matters into her own hands and stands up to both sources of authority. Esther assumes control of Mordecai's plan, changing and amending as she sees fit. Like Vashti, she will appear before the king only when she decides that the time is right, in this case, after 3 days of fasting. Instead of following Mordecai's suggestion and simply taking her petition, she will throw a series of parties as Vashti did. In order to succeed, Esther realizes she must take on aspects of the repudiated former queen. Purim is a holiday in which we explore and challenge our boundaries. We dress up as other people. Some of us drink to the point where differences become blurred. In the spirit of this holiday and the following the legacy of our ancestor Esther, I encourage us to re-examine whom we emulate and from whom we shy away. We may discover, as Esther did, that we are not so different from those whom we fear, and that the most important lessons can be learned from the unlikeliest of teachers. I found this piece to be incredibly powerful. And again, like, there's so much more to it that we didn't even get a chance to read because this was already so long. Which is to say, we set up Vashti, and I set up Vashti here as a bit of a foil for us. Is she hero or villain? The answer is neither. She's a person. She has good qualities and bad qualities, things that are good and bad, challenging, helpful, whatever. And we have what to learn from her, any which way. And like Esther, we have what to learn from her as well, from her experience and her example. And the two of them, in contrast and in comparison, and in their similarities, there's what to learn. And so I'd be so curious to hear what all of you think, holding all of this Vashti Torah all together.
I know that I learned from the negative.
Sorry, let's go to Larry first, and then Sheila, come to you.
I'm sorry.
You know, seeing this in a broader context with the rest of Chumash and everything else, to me, it kind of makes sense, first of all, that they're arguing about this and that there is nothing definitive. But if you take it like it's supposed to be almost, even though we're not sure if it happened, like a history. History is obviously written by the winners. And here, the rabbis obviously are the winners. So you have to make a person one or the other to justify something within your own ideology, to justify what that person is. Hagar, Esau, all these people, you know, if they were just people and nothing else, if they were multidimensional, then perhaps we wouldn't get them in a way, in the light they are normally presented to us, and the lessons would be lost, perhaps. You know, Achashverosh has to be the bad guy, because if he's just doing whatever he does and everything else, then the story kind of doesn't hold together. That Haman obviously is the bad guy. It's possible some people may see Haman as not so bad after a while, and if that's coming up also, you know, that maybe he's justified and he has some grudge against the Jews and everything else. So there has to be a certain direction that the majority take. And I think a lot of this is because of our times now. You know, we're trying to justify something else. We're trying to put people in a certain light, which isn't a bad thing. I think we can learn from that as we are doing now. But I think it's basically, they were what they were. The stories portray them in a certain light. It's a narrative, and if you don't have a protagonist, you don't have this, you don't have that, the story doesn't hold itself, you know. And so it's basically, you're trying to move the story along, and so you have to have a certain view of the characters. And I think we're trying to, like I say, we're trying to put modern sensibilities on all this, which is fine. But I think, and part of what I always say is, whenever you look at a rabbi, a baraita, or something else, you have to look at it in the historical context. Who was the person who wrote it? When was the time? So obviously, the feminist view you're going to get now, when there was a rabbi who perhaps in his own right of the times were against women that come out stronger, that come out differently. So to me, this is very much a reflection of what went on and is going on now still in trying to portray people in a different, multidimensional, I guess is the best word.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's something really true. And I think all the more so our human or Jewish inclination to take a story that probably doesn't have all of these dimensions and try and squeeze them in and, use a crowbar to get as many, multi-dimensional pieces to it in there. And I think there's something true with that. The only exception I'll say is I don't know that I've ever seen anyone suggest that Haman is a good guy. I think we could just say he's a terrible dude. He's evil. We could just, I'm sort of kidding, but not really. Right? Some people remain their single dimension, but I think you're right, and I think it's an inclination that we have as modern folk to want to give people the benefit of the doubt, to give people multi dimensions. We all have challenges and conflicts with other people, myself included, and we always have that inclination to say, well, this person always does X and they're just terrible all the time to everybody they've ever met. Well, that's probably not true. They might have just had a bad day and I got the brunt of it. I was driving to pick up my daughter from school and I saw somebody would make like a quick left turn and then blocked a lane. And the person in front of me was so angry, she's like yelling out the window at this other car. It's like, I could say, how what a terrible person she is for just yelling at someone who's trying to get from place A to place B. Like, why stop the car? But perhaps she was having a bad day. Perhaps she is stressed out about something we don't know. How many dimensions can I give her, right, to her benefit, who is driving in front of me? So I think it's a powerful point. So thank you for making it, Larry. Sheila.
I have nothing.
No, you were going to say something before I wanted to give you a chance to do that.
I don't remember.
Okay. Other thoughts?
You really want something good about Haman? There had to be something good in Haman's DNA if two of his sons converted and became rabbis.
Well, but I thought all of the sons were hanged.
I thought there were a couple that weren't, and they became rabbis.
But we read their names so quickly. Who knows? No. Yeah.
Or they left town before Haman.
They were traveling from Hodu to Kush.
No, they were just older, and they were going to school elsewhere, or they were in the army elsewhere.
Part of turning the story upside down, and there's a rich cross-cultural reality, if you will, to this type of storytelling, whether it's carnival in Catholic Western Europe or other cultures. This idea that the commoner is king for a day, and the king is the commoner's subject is not that unusual. So whoever actually wrote this could have been a student of that kind of literature, if not an inventor of it in the particular culture from which they're coming. But doesn't it kind of all fit that mode, which is we don't really know what to make of certain people other than maybe Haman, because things get turned on their head. I mean, ultimately, this is the whole story about the Jews. And by the way, if Bijan were here, he would be telling us, because I think I've heard him say this before, that all of this is viewed as history by Iranian Jews. But this idea that your entire people get condemned over a slight that Mordecai makes to a powerful official, and then that gets completely turned on its head, and the idea that the king's edicts can't be overturned, but you could make a new edict that effectively overturns it. all of these things are so why not Vashti and Esther looking in the mirror, I think is the way she puts it, and seeing that maybe she looks a lot more like Vashti than she thought. Because she does seem meek at first. You know, he has to make that whole statement, Mordecai does, that deliverance will come from another place. Place being, if you will, the only possible name of God in the whole story. And she says, all right, you know, fast for me. And then if I die, I die. If I perish, I perish.
Yeah.
And then she has the guts to go do it. And, you know, it says, I guess, that he loves her, or she's either he loves her or she's so beautiful, or maybe it's a combination of both, that he extends the scepter so she's okay, even though she came without permission.
Maybe he learned from the way he treated Vashti.
Well, so fortunately, we have 5 more times together where we can unpack all of these little by little. I don't know exactly what all 5 will be yet, but we will discover it together. I want to leave you with a couple of things. First of all, to just share some gratitude for letting us explore this wonky Vashti story in a way that I think is pretty interesting. And I think to remember that understanding changes over time, that not one thing means one thing forever. Context matters, history matters, who we are in that moment matters. You know, the rabbis the rabbis in Babylonia, who are generally doing fine, but certainly under Babylonian thumb, being able to complain against a queen of Babylonian descendants sort of makes sense in its own. But that we are reminded to just look deeper, to see the different dimensions to that story and to Vashti, and not to see her purely as one thing, but to see her as many things, to allow her to be a full-fledged person and not just the thing we want to put on her in that moment. And that's certainly a lesson we could do for anyone we encounter, Vashti notwithstanding. I want to put a couple of things in the chat for those folks who might want to look a little deeper. The first thing is a YouTube link, which the second link I send will be relevant to as well. This is to that video I was telling you about, that Achashverosh is not who he seems, is not who you think. The second one has all of the interviews that we did. They were last year around Purim. Rabbi Chaya Bender was the one I'm sending. We did a number of different interviews with different rabbis around the world. We did one in Israel, not in Israel, but in the West Coast and the East Coast. And Rabbi Hal was one of this Purim ones as well. So you can certainly check on that one. He's on that page. We did one of my colleagues who lives in Brazil, who's Argentinian, sharing his take on Purim. The other thing I wanted to just share, totally selfishly, is I write a newsletter. You're welcome to read what I write. I have one about coming out the next day or so, among other things. And I think there's lots of interesting Purim Torah meant in every which way that we can learn over the course of the next 6 or so weeks. I think it's 6 sessions over 7 weeks. There's a Tu B'Shvat in there somewhere on a Thursday night. And just again, to relay a tremendous amount of gratitude to share space together with you, B'nai Yeshurun community on the whole. Always glad to be back here, back in this community. And I'll just share that I recently published a book called A Better World is Possible, which you can find on my website, jeremymarkiz.com. And have a wonderful rest of your day and early Shabbat Shalom to all of you. Yes, Larry.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, just a quick thing. Are you aware that if Achashverosh through the party, there's something involved with the timing, that there was a prophecy or something that
Yes.
a king would be a certain day and he was a day off or something, and that's why he was throwing the party. I figure you probably are aware of that.
Yeah. I feel like I wrote something about this actually. The short version is, I've certainly read about it, and for folks who need to go, please do. Well, no reason to stay unless, I like to end on time. For folks who want to stick around, there were a number of prophecies. The way I understood it was that the reason why the Bar Kokhba, you'll forgive me for going backwards here, the Bar Kokhba revolt happened 70 years, like as a unit of 70 years. The reason why they did it right then is because they believed that 70 years was the length of an exile, because the first temple was destroyed and 70 years later they rebuilt it. It's like, okay, that's how God does it. And so they do it. That's why the Bar Kokhba happened again. According to the prophecy with Achashverosh, that threshold had just been crossed. That 3 years was like that marker. It's like, okay, like the redemption's not coming because I protected from Israel and their God because I survived this long. Something along those lines. I forget exact details, but that's how I understood the timing of the prophecy. I'd have to look up more details than that, but that's how I understood it. Wonderful. Thanks, Larry. Have a wonderful day.